The notice is deemed withdrawn. The honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the government nationalized the Trans Mountain Pipeline in May, I asked whether the new Crown Corporation would honour the existing contract to buy 75% of the steel from Evraz and Regina and make every effort to source the remaining 25% of steel from other Canadian mills. I welcome the opportunity this evening to further elaborate the case for using Canadian-made steel in the Trans Mountain expansion project. At the outset, I should state that Kinder Morgan decided on purely commercial grounds to buy most of the steel pipe from Evraz in Regina. What I'd like to speak to are some additional reasons to give preference to Canadian-made steel now that the project is under public ownership. And I'd like to address three topics. The first is jobs, the second is the environment, and the third is trade. Mr. Speaker, the main argument advanced in favor of the Trans Mountain expansion is that the project will create jobs for Canadians. But of course, the extent to which it creates jobs depends critically on where the materials are sourced. Importing steel pipe from offshore obviously does not create jobs in Canada, whereas buying the steel from Canadian suppliers clearly does create jobs and economic activity in our country. The Evraz steel plant has the potential to be the largest private sector employer in Regina. It's a pillar of the local economy and would make a very important contribution to employment in our city. And certainly the order to make pipe for Trans Mountain is the largest order that facility has and is really keeping it going. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also want to talk about the environment because that is often invoked as the main argument against this project. And I think it's important to note that one of the key advantages to using Canadian-made steel is that it has a much lower carbon content than steel imported from offshore. Manufacturing a ton of steel in China and shipping it here emits about 5 times as much carbon as manufacturing it at Evraz in Regina. So if our concern is to reduce carbon emissions, one of the solutions is to manufacture the steel right here in Canada. Another environmental concern has to do with the possibility of spills. A key advantage of Canadian-made steel is that we have the opportunity to rigorously inspect it throughout the manufacturing process, whereas with imported steel, we sometimes can't be as sure exactly what we're getting. So from an environmental perspective, there's a strong argument to manufacture the pipe and other materials for the Trans Mountain expansion here in Canada. The final thing I want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is trade, because of course some would suggest that despite these advantages of using Canadian-made steel, we need to honor free trade obligations. And what I would emphasize is that other countries, such as the United States, already have policies in place to favor domestic suppliers with their federal procurement. We think of the famous Buy American provisions. So really all we're saying here is that now that the project is being carried out by the federal government, it makes sense to apply the same sorts of provisions here in Canada to give preference to Canadian-made steel. And I think the case for doing so is particularly strong in the face of American tariffs currently applied to Canadian steel. If we can't sell south of the border, all the more reason to use the steel here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. He defends the interests of his region very, very strongly, especially the steel producers that he's talking about. Obviously, on this side of the House, we're committed to defending our steel and aluminum producers from coast to coast to coast. We saw that when the U.S. imposed tariffs, so we said that it was completely unacceptable, and we took retaliatory measures to ensure that we could protect our industry. We also put forward during the summer a $2 billion fund to assist the steel and aluminum industry and other industries in the context of the punitive tariffs imposed by the U.S. So I think that it's obvious that on this side of the House, we have a government that is an ally of the steel and aluminum producers and other impacted industries. With regard to the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, there were three important elements that were mentioned: trade, the environment, and jobs. And I think that when we look at trade, that is why the government stepped in to ensure that markets for Canadian resources can be exported elsewhere than the United States. We know that with regard to oil was mostly exported to Americans about 15 years ago, and even to this day we can see that 99% of our oil products are exported to the U.S. And that has an impact on the Canadian economy. It represents losses of billions of dollars each year, and it also represents jobs that are not created. And that's why the Canadian government decided that this is a promising project for the future, and that's why it decided to invest in the Trans Mountain Pipeline to ensure that we can get a fair price for our resources and funding a transition to a greener economy and greener jobs. That's also, Mr. Speaker, why we put in place the Oceans Protection Plan. We're going forward with price on pollution because we think that we have to protect the environment and also grow the economy, and that can go hand in hand because our long-term economic vitality depends on it when it comes to protecting the environment and our jobs. Thank you.
Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Parliamentary Secretary for his remarks. Certainly he has spoken quite eloquently about the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. What he has not done, and what I and people in Regina are looking for, is to see a clearer commitment to honor the existing contract to procure most of the steel for the project from the Evraz mill. I think the sense is that the project would continue on that basis, but it would be nice to hear the government give a clear yes to that question, and I hope it will come during the Parliamentary Secretary's final minute. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that the government would provide some sort of commitment and some kind of indication as to how it intends to ensure that the remaining 25% of the steel in the Trans Mountain expansion will be procured as far as possible from Canadian steel mills. Thank you again.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I'd like to thank my colleague. I think that he is a staunch defender of his region and the industries therein. As I said in my first reply, on this side of the House, this government is an ally of Canadian producers, as has been shown over and over the past few months when we were confronted with illegal tariffs by the U.S., when we put in place $2 billion for a fund to help steel and aluminum producers. So I think that he will always find a listening ear and a proactive government that will defend the interests of steel and aluminum producers and ensure their medium and long-term prosperity.